Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my February 2024 reading wrap up. That's right, we are going to be discussing what I read in February 2024, what I liked, what I didn't like, and some of my reading trends. And of course, as always, I love to hear from you guys. So please put in the comment section down below what you were reading in February, what your stats were, what you liked and what you didn't like. I love to hear from you guys and to hear about all the things that you are reading as well. First of all, before we get into the video, I apologize for the lighting. This is the only time and space I have to film for a couple days, so we're just going to have to bear with it. So please bear with me. The normal situation setup should hopefully be back soon. February 2024. It was a leap year, 29 days. However, I only read 17 books, and I'm going to get back to that comment in a section. 17 books, and this month, it was a little more heavily focused on the fiction section. I usually read over the course of a year, a very even split between fiction and nonfiction, but in February, I was more heavily focused on the fiction. I discovered some great new books that I was loving and having a great time, as well as getting out of my comfort zone by reading some romance and maybe not so romance. We'll get to that too, for Valentine's Day, which is something I like to do every year to challenge myself and to get myself out of my comfort zone. Now you may ask, 17 is a lot of books to read in a month. Why do I say only 17 books? So normally in winter, I read quite a bit more. It's really cold outside where I live and I tend to stay inside and read. That's just what I like to do. It gets dark early. I don't have a lot of energy or motivation to go outside. This year, however, I did join a sports league or several sports leagues. So I'm now playing basketball a couple days a week, and I'm just going to start up volleyball here in a couple days. So it's been really great getting me active, but it has put a little bit of damper on the normally massive volumes that I read in winter, but I do not care. I'm not going to penalize myself or force myself to keep up with numbers from previous years when I didn't play in a sports league. That's just the way it is. So 17 is maybe slightly lower than I would normally expect to read in a cold and dreary month like February, but I think it's perfectly acceptable, and I will fight anyone who says that I do not read enough in this month. I'm going to talk about every single book that I read, what I thought about them, starting with fiction, then moving to nonfiction, and then I'm going to get into some of my faves and the ones that I really didn't like this month. So let's dive into fiction. And this is just going to be grouped not in order of the chronological order I read them, but rather just kind of similar topics together. Fiction. This was a series that I picked up on a whim and wound up loving, and that is The Remarried Empress, volumes 1 through 3. I just saw it on the shelf and decided to pick it up, and I have been loving this series. Being on a sports league has not prevented me from checking out a massive number of books, as indicated by my library bookshelf back here. Volume 4 is on this shelf, hopefully going to be read in the next couple of days. I'm loving the series. I believe it was originally a webcomic, and I think the art's beautiful, the story is really sucking me in, and I'm having a great time. Next up was actually 2 books by Jim C. Hines. This was an author that I have read a few books before, and I decided I want to finish up the Open series that I had been reading from him. Open as in I hadn't finished it, The Janitors of the Post-Apocalypse, and I read the 3rd book in that series, Terminal Peace, and I enjoyed that series so much that I decided to try another Jim Hines book in February. I almost said 2023, in February, and that was Goblin Quest, and I loved Goblin Quest. I think Goblin Quest was better than any of the other books I've read by Hines, and I really liked Hines's work previous to picking up Goblin Quest. I did listen to a dramatic audiobook reading, and maybe that helped, but I really liked Goblin Quest. The premise is there's a goblin who gets sucked along on a D&D-esque adventure, and I thought it was funny while also tackling maybe some more serious topics. I think that's something that Hines does really well. He's able to have a funny fantasy, or in the case of Janitors of the Post-Apocalypse, a funny sci-fi setting while also tackling maybe a difficult question or a difficult topic in the setting that he has created. So I think he does a really good job with that, and I really liked both Terminal Peace and Goblin Quest by him in 2020, not in 2023, in February. We'll get it eventually. Next up is another continuation of a series I've been reading, Komi Can't Communicate, volume 28. It's the most recent volume. I read it. I have the review of that on my channel. It's an open series, and it's an ongoing series. So I believe the next volume comes out in April, and I will be doing another review as soon as I can get my hands on the next copy from my public library. So if you're interested in Komi Can't Communicate by Tomohito Oda, that is a manga series, check out the reviews on my channel. I have a whole dedicated playlist just to that series. Next, we're going into some new authors that I had never read before. First was KJ Parker, 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. This was a fantasy book, and I had never read anything by KJ Parker before, but I was highly impressed with this book. The premise is a very unqualified individual is forced to lead the defense efforts in a sieged city, and I thought it was funny, but also kind of being a little serious at the same time. Again, kind of feels like Jim Hines, and I like when a book can have some humorous elements while also having a more serious plot line, and I really liked this book and was overall quite impressed with it. Now, KJ Parker is, if I remember correctly, a pseudonym for, is it Tom Holt? I may be misquoting there, but he also writes under KJ Parker. I was very impressed, and I would like to check out other things that he has written to see if the writing holds up to that same level of writing that was demonstrated in 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. Next was a book that was marked in my library as horror, but I scare very easily. And I thought someone was breaking in. I scare very easily. Case in point. And I was not sure if I was going to like it. I would probably classify this more as creepy fantasy than horror because I didn't get scared reading it, unlike being scared when someone rattled the doorknob of my apartment. And this was Lacrimore by S.J. Costello. This was a thin book, about 180 pages, and it centers on a very creepy island and an individual who has been brought there to perform funeral rites on a man that when she arrives, she finds out is still living, and maybe people in the household have different motivations than just being there to help and assist this dying man. I thought the book was very well done and interesting. Don't let the little horror tag, if your library tagged it similar to mine, deter you if you don't really read horror. I don't at all. I find it way too creepy, but I would describe this as more of like an off-putting, unsettling fantasy series, and I wound up actually really enjoying it, and it wasn't so scary that I couldn't sleep at night or anything like that. Finally, the last 3 fiction books are books that I was reading for my Valentine's Day romance read. So every year for Valentine's Day, I check out some romance books from my library and I give them a read. So I never want to close myself off to a type of book just because I haven't liked it in the past, especially a genre as big and diverse as romance. And even though I'm not a romance reader, I don't really like a romance reader. I don't really like romance as a genre, I should say. Romance readers are fine. That made it sound like I dislike romance readers. I dislike the romance genre generally. Every year for Valentine's Day, I try to get some books, read them, and step out of my comfort zone. Now, most of them I don't like, and I know that going into it, but occasionally I found some interesting books. And some books are so bad they've turned around to being funny, or at least being a good story. So I can always expect to have a few surprises, and I'm glad that I'm getting out of my comfort zone every year. This year is no exception. I picked 3 this year, and we're gonna go through those right now. The first was a book that I actually had high expectations for. I wanted to read it even before this Valentine's Day challenge, and that was Role Playing by Kathy Yardley. The book centers on 2 older adults. I mean, older being relative, but it's not people in their 20s or people in their 40s and 50s who meet playing an online game together, and then of course the romance ensues. This was by Kathy Yardley. I don't know if I mentioned that already. The premise sounded really interesting to me, and honestly the first 25% of that book was really interesting and I liked it, but the last 75% just fell apart for me and I did not like it. Unfortunately, I did select this book to be my book club's book of the month, and we're going to be doing book club in a couple weeks, so I'm going to apologize profusely. I have a whole review of that if you want to see all my problems. That one was probably the most disappointing because I wanted it to be good, and when I want a book to be good and then it's not good, it's somehow worse than not having that expectation of an enjoyable read going into it, if that makes sense. Next is a collection of novellas, well, collection. It was 2 novellas in one by Laura Lee and Jackie or J.C. Burton, and that was Naughty and Wild. And this was a book that was definitely way outside my comfort zone. You can check out my extensive review on my channel. I don't know if extensive is the right word, but it was erotica, and I didn't know that. And romance is already very difficult for me to read, and so erotica was almost unreadable. It was unreadable. It was a novella, so it was only a couple pages, or a couple 120, 130, 140 pages, and it took me 3 days to get through because I couldn't do it. I couldn't be bothered. It was so awful to read and embarrassing. I have a whole review and I'm getting wrapped up in it. Naughty and Wild was interesting, and it was erotica, and I definitely suspected erotica was not my thing, and I've confirmed it in this reading of Naughty and Wild. Finally, I read I checked out and I read When I Found You by Brendan Novak. This was a book that I can best describe as gentle, but definitely not my cup of tea. This is what I call depressor mom fiction, and I really didn't like it. Brendan Novak seems to be a very nice, kind writer, and I definitely think there's an audience for her, but the audience is not me, and while it was romance, it was not my type of romance. So none of the romance books that I read this year for February 2024 wound up being enjoyable for me, but that is just the nature of the beast. Sorry, my cat's making a ton of racket. Now let's move into nonfiction. So nonfiction was a little slower this year over the course of an entire year, slower this month. Over the course of an entire year, I do read about an even split of fiction and nonfiction. However, this month I focused more heavily on the fiction. So this month in nonfiction, I read 2 books by Melissa Gish. These wound up being children's nonfiction books, and I was expecting them to be adult. I placed holds on them for my library, but I still read them. And these were fairies and trolls. I was looking for maybe an introduction or a collection of fantasy art in both of these categories, but it just wound up being a collection of kids, like a kid's book on these 2 topics, and it wasn't really enjoyable just because I'm not the target audience. And I think sometimes that happens where a book isn't necessarily bad, but I am not the target audience. Out of the 2, if I remember correctly, I liked the Trolls book more, if I remember correctly. I'm not entirely sure, but I remember being very disappointed, but also I couldn't truly give a bad review just because the books were not targeted to me. So I was not the target audience, and also my expectations going in or when I placed holds on that book were just not where they were, so it is what it is. I read both those. I feel like it's a little cheating because 2 of my 17 books were kids books that took me maybe half an hour to flip through. So I feel like my true number is 15, but they're 2 books. So they got 2 separate entries on Goodreads. Next is The Art of Japanese Prints. This was a collection of Japanese woodblock prints, and while the overall book was interesting, it gave a good chronological collection of the Japanese print art history from beginning to end. I think that at this point in my reading journey, I guess you could say, I've read a number of books on Japanese woodblock prints, and therefore this book tended to be very basic, and a lot of it was review and things I already knew. That being said, it did introduce me to another artist that I wanted to check out. The name is saved to my phone, and I don't know it right now just because I haven't read a book on it, but I do have a name written down from that book that I want to check out. So overall, it wasn't an entire wash. It just maybe was a little bit more basic than what I was hoping for or expecting at this time. The next was a book that I did not review on my channel. So all these other books, I believe, looking through them, have reviews on my channel with the exception of this one, and that is A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. This was a book I listened to an audiobook. It was actually a book that I had on my to-read list for a long time, just never got around to it. And I got around to listening to it on audiobook, primarily when working out at the gym. So I finally got around to it and I had an enjoyable time. I thought it was funny, but I just chose not to review it on my channel. Next is another book featuring Japan, and that is World Heritage Japan by John Lander. So this is a collection of UNESCO World Heritage sites in Japan through the photography of John Lander. And the photography was interesting, the books were interesting. I do want to put a disclaimer. This is not a guidebook, this is not a tourism book, this is just a essay information photography collection, and the photography is beautiful, so I do recommend it for that. I do have a whole review of that on my channel, but it was an enjoyable and overall interesting read. Finally, saving the best for last, I read Flatland by Edwin Abbott. This was a book that takes the idea that we live in the 3rd dimension and breaks it down to how would we interact if we were in a 2-dimensional world. So we are reading a story, a fictionalized story narrated by a square who is living in a 2-dimensional plane. And he talks about the social history and the customs of the 2-dimensional plane he lives in, and before he has an extraterrestrial sort of encounter with a sphere who opens up Square's mind to the idea of a 3rd dimension. The obvious extrapolation from this is if the square living in the 2-dimensional world, that is the only world he knows, is suddenly exposed to a higher dimension, what would it be like for us, living in a more 3-dimensional world, to be taken out and see things in 4-dimension, or so on and so forth as the dimensions go up. It's also a little bit of a social critique, but I really liked the aspect of how things would interact and appear and how you might work or live life in a two-dimensional plane, and I thought it was very well done. It was a fantastic read. It was written in the late 1800s, so it's definitely held up over the years, and I think Abbott did a great job with this book. I really recommend it, and I think that it would be an interesting read to anyone who's interested in math, or, well, I don't even think you have to be interested in math. If you're just interested in the concept of how life would be in a two-dimensional plane, Flatland by Edwin Abbott would be a great book for you to check out and read. It is a little shorter, so you don't have to commit to reading 400, 500 pages, and gives you a great overview of the topic mentioned. Those are all the books that I read. Now I'm just going to quickly talk about my favorites. So maybe I already mentioned, but my favorite was Flatland by Edwin Abbott. Just loved it, had a great time, highly recommend, easily a 5-star read. But I do have two runner-ups, and these are both in the fiction category. The first was 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. I was just really impressed by KJ Parker's writing, and I want to check out something else by him. And the next was Goblin Quest by Jim C. Hines. I was really impressed with the writing in that one, and I thought it was funny. There were some laugh out loud moments, but also the overall adventure kept my attention very well, so I really liked those two fantasy books this month as well, so I wanted to give them an honorable mention next to Flatland. And now the ones I didn't like. Maybe these are obvious. First being Naughty and Wild, Erotica's Not My Cup of Tea. I have a whole book explaining why it's not my cup of tea. And the other one being Role Playing. This one was just so disappointing because I wanted it to be good, and it was really difficult to read when it wasn't good. So I'm very disappointed in it, and I wish it was better, in essence. What did you read in February 2024? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.